So, hi everyone. It's my joy to be here today with our good friend from Glencoe Union Church, Pastor David Wood. Hi, David.
Hello, Wendy. Hello, everybody. Pleasure to be here always with you, if not in person, at least this way.
We were saying before, usually at some point, often in the springtime, I guess, we often do sort of each of us does a visit to the other's church or synagogue respectively. And this year, there's something wonderful about the opportunity to do this in collaboration in a way that both of our communities, and I guess anyone else who happens upon this video, will have the opportunity to see the same thing together.
Because we missed it entirely last year, right? We were just sort of, we were not ready to do anything.
No, we were really, we were at the very beginning of all of this.
Yep.
Yeah. I can't speak for you, but I was I was pretty shell shocked at that point in time.
Well, we were scrambling. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
And it's interesting actually that the alignment of this year of pandemic is sort of bookended at this point with Passover and Easter on one end or the other.
Yeah.
Kind of. It's not over, obviously, but we can mark it or demark it that way.
Yeah.
So that's what brings us together today, is this opportunity we find ourselves in this year, especially where for the Jewish community, we've been observing Passover this past week since last Saturday. And for the Christian community, they're in Holy Week, all leading up to Easter Sunday for them. And for us, the end of Passover, which for some may be the 7th day, and for others may be the 8th day. And interestingly enough, the 8th day of Passover and Easter Sunday align this year exactly. So we thought we would just take a little bit of time together to reflect on the salient messages of these holidays, these seasons of renewal and rebirth, of redemption and everything that comes along with that. And then to do a little bit of reflection on, maybe just more personally, what we're kind of thinking about in this season, this year in particular. So David, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about, your sort of what you're thinking about Easter this year, salient messages, what you're holding in your community.
Yeah, so let me just review for a little bit for folks. As you just mentioned, this is Holy Week. So for us, Holy Week began on Sunday, last Sunday, with what we call Palm Sunday. And that's the occasion that we remember on that day is Jesus's entrance into Jerusalem. And with palms, and it was a sort of a parade, if you will, kind of a mixed bag of parade, but a parade nonetheless. Jesus riding in not as a warrior, but on a donkey as a Prince of Peace, if you will. So that sort of begins the week, and then for most traditions, not much happens Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. Even though in other traditions, let's say the Roman Catholic tradition, maybe the Episcopalian tradition, there will be things that will be happening every day. And there's certain narrative sequences that certain churches follow. That on Thursday, we all come together across traditions to celebrate what we call Maundy Thursday, which is Maundy means command. And so it's the night that the last night Jesus met with his disciples, and he gave them a new commandment, which was to love one another as I have loved you. And so and he washes the feet, and they share the meal, which is still a little bit controversial whether it was a Passover meal or another kind of meal, but it was somewhere clearly within the Jewish tradition, a meal with his followers, and that was the last meal. And then later that evening, he is arrested and betrayed, and then of course on Friday, Good Friday, crucified, and then Saturday is a kind of quiet day when, in effect, nothing happens. And it's the Sabbath day, of course. So, and of course, it's not as if nothing happens on Sabbath, but it is a day of rest in a deep way for the Christian tradition in this particular day. And then Sunday, as you said, we celebrate Easter Sunday. I just thought it was interesting you mentioned that it's the 8th day. There's an 8th day of Passover on Sunday. In a Christian tradition, there is a not a real well-known tradition, but that Easter is called the 8th day.
Huh.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just sort of connected. So it is, this as if the 7th day, of course, is the Sabbath and the culmination of time. But then there was something about the 8th day that was, it's beyond time, right? It was sort of the beginning of another kind of time. So I can't remember all the exact connotations, but it is this notion of a new day, and a new beginning. So that's interesting. That's as you and I were talking beforehand, you said it's so interesting this week the way Passover falls, and it corresponds so fully with Holy Week, and that strikes me as probably very very ancient in terms of what may have happened in the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. I've never heard that actually, that it's referred to as the 8th day.
Yeah.
That's very fascinating.
So, for me, I think I've been thinking a lot about how we have been living collectively. And maybe this is saying it too starkly, but I want to say we've been living in the valley of the shadow of death. That's how it feels to me, that we have, as a society, we've been living, I don't want to say in fear of death, but certainly in awareness of it, right? With a lot of anxiety. And so we can talk more about this, but that's when you ask me how I'm coming into this week, that's what I'm coming into this week with a strong awareness of.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's interesting, just when you said that, it actually opened up for me something that I hadn't been thinking about Passover, but now I will, which is this interesting tension that exists in the Passover narrative between this pervasive threat of death. Of course, Passover, I guess I should say, Passover begins in our Jewish narrative biblically while the Hebrews are still enslaved, right? Before the 10th plague has been brought about. And the 10th plague, of course, the most horrific of all of them, the death of the Egyptian firstborn population. And the that word Passover comes from this idea that the Hebrews were told to paint blood, goat blood, lamb blood on their doorposts, the lintels, and that would cause this angel of death to pass over them. And they were commanded to take part in a meal with all sorts of different components in a posture where they would be ready to go, but they don't leave until the next day, right? So they're imagining what's yet to be,
right. Anticipating.
They have no sense of that at all. Their reality is one that is pretty dismal and horrific. Although they have been, they have not experienced the ramifications of the plagues personally. They've watched it happen all around them. And so I imagine it's like a similar fearfulness. And then, of course, as the week goes on, the Jews are freed, but then they are pursued by the Egyptians again. So this sense of impending imminent death, of which they are ultimately saved again and again and again, is always a tension at play. And I hadn't thought about that overlaid back to this past year and sort of what that sensibility might feel like.
Yeah, and so and of course it's very common for Christians this week to tell the Exodus story and to interpret that through the lens of the life of Christ and the experience of this Holy Week. Sort of it creates the framework for the whole drama, actually, in the Christian tradition, which I think might surprise a lot of Jewish people if that's the case, right?
That fascinating.
The sense is that, like, for instance, in the Gospel of John, we have 4 Gospels that tell the life of Jesus, and the Gospel of John seems to purposefully have Jesus sacrificed at exactly the same time that the sacrificial lamb is being sacrificed in the temple, in terms of the chronology.
Yeah.
So it's a very deliberate, intentional, what should we say, sort of intersection of these traditions, and not meant to conflict or conflate, but that one can't be understood without the other. That's from the Christian tradition.
Yeah. And I think that idea of kind of like the overlaying of one narrative onto another.
Right.
Look, I mean, all of us still do that today. I mean, that's how literature has evolved. That's how art has evolved. That's our histories evolve that way. We tell the same stories in different ways, or find ourselves back in older stories. And it gives us a sense of depth, a sense of connectivity beyond ourselves, either across time or, across space or across time, I guess we might say. So it's interesting to think of that just with Easter and Passover, just with narratives.
And
at the end of the day,
yeah,
they each have their own particular story to tell, but the narrative tropes are so similar.
Yes. And I would go even further to say, again, from the standpoint of Christian tradition, and this sounds very, what should we say? It's certainly not something that the Christian community has lived out well. But the fact remains that you cannot really comprehend the meaning of the Christian narrative apart from the Jewish tradition, the Jewish history. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's only from within the construct of Judaism that the meaning of death and the shedding of blood and the notion of how this brings about Exodus, right, is deeply embedded in the story. So in other words, excuse me, I think we could say, obviously, the Jewish community has its story. It doesn't need the Christian story to understand its story. But that's not true in the Christian tradition. We can't really grasp the meaning of our story if we somehow dissociate it, disconnect it, detach it from the Jewish story.
Yeah, and even I would say, yes, certainly the Jewish community has its own story and doesn't need another culture or religion's story to clarify its story. But it's interesting that one of the key commandments to the Jewish people throughout time about Passover, to practice on Passover, is one is commanded to see oneself as if they themselves had personally gone out of Egypt.
Right.
So it is, it's interesting that there is this opportunity or invitation on the one hand, or, some might say command or demand on the other, that if one is interested in full understanding, the only way to do that is to put themselves back to the Ur text, to the original narrative from whatever it was. Whether that's for the sake of an individual or for the sake of a collective group of people, still the same kind of idea.
Yeah, and at the center of Passover is that one of the central movement is that of remembrance, right, and recollection, and that's absolutely true for the Christian community in this Holy Week. So, and that is a deeply Jewish thing, right? That sort of notion of what memory does and what it brings to the moment, to the present, and how crucial that is.
In this, as we're talking, it brings up another question to me, and I'm curious your thoughts about this. And I don't know if this aligns with Easter and Passover or not, but I will say, so one of the interesting tensions that comes with Passover, and it's one of the things that's really resonated with me in particular this year, is for us, it is a redemptive moment, but it is not the redemption, right? Our people are freed from bondage to the wilderness,
right,
to become a free people who will eventually make it to the promised land, again to be exiled, in yearning one day to return. And at the end of every Passover Seder, we say next year in Jerusalem, meaning next year, the redemption will come, right? There's also, we have this thing, many of your parishioners may have heard about it, but like Elijah comes, you invite Elijah to your Seder, and you have a cup of wine, you open the door, but like he never shows up.
Right.
Because when he shows up, it means the redemption is upon us.
Yeah.
So, but Elijah's never coming to anybody's. Right? So we have this sense in Jewish tradition of a tension between like wanting to get somewhere, but not getting to the final destination.
Okay.
I would call it like the phenomena of not yet.
Okay.
Right? And I wonder about that tension in Christianity with Easter.
Yeah.
Because he is risen, right?
Right.
And yet.
Yeah. So that's really interesting, because I think there is very much a parallel for us in that the way we talk about it theologically is about the already and the not yet. So there is, in one sense, I think you're right to indicate that there is seems to be more of an already in Christianity, because it's happened, if you will, it's happened. In one sense, it's already happened. In another sense, it has not happened, because we still die, we still bury people's remains dissolve into, the earth, et cetera, or wherever. And so there is this interesting, and so you have some traditions within Christianity that focus on the already. Right. And so there's a kind of otherworldliness, so we call it, kind of, a sort of denial of the life as it continues to be, and the suffering and the pain, et cetera, that we still experience in this life, and not really an ability to absorb that or integrate that. And then you have others who are just completely, in terms of the not yet. And so there's not really any living hope in the moment. It just sort of is all off in the future. So you can see within the Christian tradition a lot of movements between that. But the best part of the Christian tradition is when people live with this tension, as you put it, this tension between what is and what is yet to be. And in Christ, there is this conviction we have seen what will be. Right. We have seen the already. And the fact that it happened in time and history is the source of the hope that it too will happen to each of us. Yeah. So there is that sense, but I think this is why living the narrative of Holy Week is so important, because in effect, I think over the years, I've come to think that, again, within the Christian construct of this Holy Week, we dwell in the face of Good Friday. We know that is the reality of our world. Death is there. But in effect, I think we live actually in Holy Saturday. It's when, we know that there is death, but after death, there is silence. I mean, that's what there is. It's silent. And yet there's a third day coming. That's the Christian narrative. Yeah. It's as one Black preacher preached, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming, but we live on Saturday. Our lives existentially live on Saturday, which is where we are by the gravesides. There's no stone rolled away yet. It's just silence. And that's where we live. But that is infused with the anticipation, to go back to your word earlier, of Sunday, of that Easter morning, of that great getting up morning. Yeah. And it just strikes me that like the living in between the already and the not yet, and you could obviously reverse those two. It's probably timeless ultimately where one would place those. Yeah. Isn't that the truth of all of our lives, all of the time anyway? Yeah. Of course, I think for all of us, this year has felt like a living in the Saturday, or living in the in-between of this sense of every step forward. I know for me, when I heard that a vaccine had been created, I was like, oh my God, thank God, there's a redemption. And I had to officiate at a funeral that day of someone who died from COVID-19. So, and that just strikes me as so much of the experience of this past year, living in a place of wanting to embrace life, being terrified of what surrounds, hoping for something better, for healing, redemption, rebirth, whatever that might mean. But it's not, I don't know how you feel about it, but like, I feel like as clergy, one of the gifts we have is we know that this year is not unique. We always live in the middle. We always are in the Saturday. I think that's right. And I think that, we live in a culture, right, that has managed to, push off sort of the reality of death to the margins of most of our lives. And especially living here in the North Shore. I mean, we hedge ourselves against the awareness of death. And so I think the fact that we could not do that over this past year has been instructive in lots of ways. I think it's interesting this week, the juxtaposition for me of Holy Week and the George Floyd trial, the trial of Chauvin, I forget his name, but that the way that trial has been unfolding throughout the week, it's just been, I mean, just,
yes,
what's the word? It's just been heartbreaking.
yes,
All over again, right?
yeah.
And the impact that had when it happened, but it's as if it's now that narrative is reemerging. And I think as we move into Good Friday, that is bringing to me such a deep awareness of we have to stay tuned into the suffering of the world.
Yeah.
And when the Christian tradition is at its best, that is at the center
Yes.
of its understanding of what it means to live faithfully.
Which is, I mean, which is so similar to the notion, I mean, it's so similar to a Jewish ethos, but in particular, that idea of identifying with suffering in Passover, right? One is commanded to see themselves as if they were a slave. Right? As if they had been redeemed. Literally, put yourselves in the shoes of the one who suffered, of the one who was redeemed. And I think that's probably a place of a little bit of variance between the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, a bit, but I think the salient messages underneath are the same, that it's only in that empathy, it's only in that personal, it's not just recounting, right? It's imagining oneself, empathetic imagination, maybe.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's why in the Christian tradition, we don't, the symbol of the Christian tradition is not an empty tomb. I mean, in other words, we don't symbolize that. It's not, it's almost impossible to symbolize. So what we do symbolize is the symbol of death, right? The cross is what, and so Christians are in effect, without often not all of them realize this, but they are in effect identifying their tradition as one that has this reality of suffering, innocent suffering at the center of its meaning and understanding. And that, I think you're right, your word of the empathic imagination is central to what it means to be faithful.
Yeah, and it's just such an interest that it's a fascinating idea for, I think, anyone of any faith tradition, or perhaps of no faith tradition at all, to invite a question for themselves around how might I empathically imagine myself in whatever opportunity presents itself to me, so that I might be a part of catalyzing a redemption, a rebirth, a renewal. You speak of George Floyd, and I would say, very much like the first time, I have found the recounting and the horror of watching a person die. So just so traumatic. And I'm a million miles away from anyone personally connected to this person, right? But as a human, and I really am not interested in anyone's political views on this matter. It is distraction to me. There is a human demand in my spiritual viewpoint to understand that anytime a human's life is taken from them by the hands or knee of another, you must first cultivate empathy,
you can't watch this. I mean, just to see the juxtaposition between these people standing there and desperate.
Yeah.
And even now, as they talk on the stand, they break down uncontrollably and cry a year later. And and I think none of us can watch that without feeling.
No.
And then the juxtaposition of at least one other person who is engaged, who seems to have absolutely in the videos no
Correct.
awareness, no nothing.
Yeah.
That is, it feels it's inhuman,
Right.
entirely inhuman.
Yeah.
And
I worry though that there are some who are learning to watch this without feeling.
yeah,
And I think that is the question for us to ask ourselves, if, to call ourselves into accountability around is, are we allowing ourselves to be anesthetized
yeah,
to what suffering looks like? Because it's not hard to find something to empathetically imagine yourself in the shoes of, in the place of. So, maybe that's one of the important opportunities that both of our faith traditions invite us into, is that sort of awareness. I hope.
I think it says something too about the way this story has gripped the world, right? It's gripped this story of one person, how it has had such enormous impact, and what it, because it seems, in the best sense, it does seem to touch on something that is just so innately human.
Yeah.
And I think again that to me gets close to the very soul of Christianity in the best sense, is that it draws us into that awareness and that narrative in a redemptive way.
Yeah.
Not in a sense of oppression, but a redemptiveness, and calls us to be, identified with those who suffer, and for the sake of their liberation.
Which is the very best thing that could come out of something horrible.
Yes.
Um,
And let me just say this. What, in light of all that said, what is so tragic for me in the Christian tradition, and you know this much better than I do, is that there's so many occasions in the Christian Jewish narrative where the worst things have happened on Easter, right? Between these two traditions, not from the Jewish side at all, but from the Christian side. I mean, the enormity of that tragedy. And of course, I'm talking about the Holocaust, so I'm talking about a lot more than that as well. It's just absolutely anathema to the Christian tradition that this is what has happened, that it became an occasion for destruction and for the taking of life, and, well, all of that. I just want to say that this is so, it's so, what's the right word? It's so utterly contradictory to what the original story was. That's all I can say.
Well, that's appreciated, and I do think recognized by many more Christians today than it ever has been before.
I think so. Yes.
And certainly continues, we pray, to move in that direction. But there is something interesting. I'm going back to the idea of symbols and experiences, and what the choices we make about where we will let them, what messages we think they represent, and where we let that inspire us or drive us. And we can choose to let something inspire us toward self-inflation, aggrandizing our own power, or we can see them as radical calls to empathy. And I wonder if ultimately everything isn't just that choice.
Yeah.
Pick a path.
Yeah, that's true. And it's a reminder too, right, of how these narratives that we think are so powerful and redemptive to life can become twisted.
Yes.
Right. And used in a way that then becomes destructive and utterly contradictory. Yeah.
I think they don't become twisted. I think we twist them.
Yes, that's right.
That's the only thing that I just, as a believer in human agency, at least from the Jewish standpoint, I would say, speaking from that, I would say that we are called into accountability for our actions.
Yep.
To understand that there may be an eternal narrative, but what we choose to do with that narrative ultimately is our choice. And we will see it through one way or another.
Yeah.
And, it's very possible that someone could interpret what it means to see oneself as if he, she, they had been redeemed from Egypt and understand it as a total justification for privilege.
Yeah.
Look what I've been through. I don't ever have to do that again. Now,
Right.
I don't owe anything to anybody. Is that a distortion of the intentionality of the text? Yes. Why do we know that? Because it says so in the Torah not to do that. But could I choose to close my eyes to that part? Sure.
Yeah.
But am I accountable for making that choice? You better believe it.
Yeah. No, it's good. Yep. And I think that very much is true within the Christian tradition as well. And I think your point about the tradition itself remains true.
Yeah.
It is we who falsify it in the worst possible ways, but that doesn't falsify the tradition.
Right. Yeah. And hopefully that it just means that we also can be, the testifiers to it. We can be the propagators of it in its best sense, as well.
It means there's always the possibility to become true again.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that not the tradition is what it is, but because the tradition is true, we always have the possibility of becoming true once again, even when we live falsely and falsify.
And isn't that the ultimate renewal, rebirth, and redemption anyway?
Indeed.
Indeed. Well, I've so appreciated this conversation, just as I appreciate every opportunity to speak with you, my friend. And I look forward to hoping we can continue our conversations, God willing, in person sooner rather than later.
Well, I can't say enough to you, to your community, for how much you all have brought to my life and awareness of my own faith, right? I mean, it's just, whenever I go places or talk to my colleagues, I say one of the great things, if not the greatest thing about where I am, is that I have real relationships with rabbis and with Jewish communities. And that is a privilege that I will treasure for a long time.
Yeah, right back at you. It's totally mutually shared and a real gift. Just a real gift.
Thanks. So, well, next year in person.
Next year in person. Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Thank you so much. All of our good wishes for a blessed remainder of Holy Week and an Easter of rebirth and renewal for your community at Glencoe Union Church, and to our community. We are looking forward to celebrating Shabbat together and concluding Passover.
Indeed. Blessed Passover to all of you as well.
Thank you so much. So good to be with you.
Thanks, Wendy.